I'm speaking to Joey Shea, a researcher in the Middle East and North Africa division at Human Rights Watch, about the United Arab Emirates' decade-long crackdown on basic rights and freedoms. We're speaking following a surge in politically motivated extraditions of dissidents between Arab League countries, notably Egyptian-Turkish activist and poet Abdul Rahman Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was deported unlawfully in January from Lebanon to the UAE and has since disappeared. Rights groups have warned that Qaradawi is at great risk of torture and ill treatment during his enforced disappearance, abuses that Human Rights Watch has documented as being part of the UAE's criminal justice system. But Qaradawi's case is not an anomaly, it is part of a pattern. Counterterrorism laws have long criminalised the right to assembly and freedom of expression and are used to imprison human rights defenders. In July 2024, a UAE court convicted scores of defendants, sentencing 40 to life in prison in a mass trial known as the UAE 84 trial. Nearly all the defendants had already spent 11 years in prison as victims of a previous sham trial. I speak to Shea about the UAE's sustained crackdown and what could have happened to the many dissidents who have disappeared into Emirati prisons. Thank you for joining us here today. What restrictions does the UAE impose on the right to free speech and assembly?
Over the past decade, UAE authorities have engaged in a sustained crackdown on basic rights and freedoms. Basic freedoms like freedom of expression, assembly, and association are explicitly criminalized under Emirati law through the counterterrorism law, the anti-cybercrime law. And these laws have been used to persecute human rights defenders and political dissidents. And sometimes, so for example, the case of Ahmed Mansour, arguably the UAE's most famous human rights defender. He was originally sentenced to 10 years based off of his peaceful expression and his human rights work. Earlier this year, he was resentenced to 15 years in prison, again, based purely off of his peaceful human rights work and his expression.
Turning to the case of Abdul Rahman Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the Turkish-Egyptian dissident who was extradited from Lebanon to the UAE in January, do we have any more news of Qaradawi? Where do you think he is and what could be happening to him?
So in the case of Abdul Rahman Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he was deported unlawfully from Lebanon to the UAE on January 8th. And this was despite groups like Human Rights Watch alongside a coalition of 16 other Lebanese and international human rights groups warning of the dangers of his extradition from Lebanon to the UAE. Since his arrival to the UAE on January 8th, we have zero information about him. We don't know where he is. He has not been able to access a lawyer, speak to his family, and unfortunately, it's this period of enforced disappearance where his life is most at risk, and where he is most at risk of ill treatment and torture and a myriad of other abuses that Human Rights Watch has documented as happening within the UAE's criminal justice system.
Why are there fears that he's being subjected to ill treatment, torture and medical neglect in detention?
Yeah, so Human Rights Watch has documented these grave violations within the UAE's justice system for over a decade now. We have documented political dissidents, people like Abdul Rahman Yusuf al-Qaradawi being subjected to prolonged solitary confinement, other forms of ill treatment like assaults and beatings, the use of very loud music to prevent individuals from sleeping, and broad neglect in prison systems. So this is a pattern of abuse that we have documented within many different cases.
Were there any legal grounds whatsoever for extraditing him to the UAE if he's not an Emirati citizen?
Abdul Rahman had traveled to Syria after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and while in Syria, he recorded a video where he criticized the governments of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. He was arrested upon return to Lebanon at the Lebanese border crossing by Lebanese authorities, and this was on December 28th. On December 30th, Emirati authorities issued a request for his arrest to Lebanese authorities. They argued that, or they said that he faced charges in the UAE of spreading false news, of disturbing public security, and using information to disturb public security. Now, Human Rights Watch has reviewed this video in question, and our assessment is that it violates no recognized recognizable offenses under international law, and that he is being persecuted for exercising his right to free speech. And it's important to note that this offense did not occur in the UAE. He is not an Emirati citizen. The only recognizable link that we can make is his criticism of UAE authorities in this video.
And could you talk about the protests that were held a few weeks ago to demand his release? I understand you were present.
Yeah, so a few weeks ago in London and elsewhere in Europe, activists from throughout the region gathered to demand Abdul Rahman's immediate and unconditional release from Emirati authorities, and to also demand that UAE authorities reveal his whereabouts, ensure that he is given proper medical attention and is not being ill-treated. It was a beautiful scene in front of the UAE consulate in London. The Emirati embassy had in fact covered its plaque with a sheet of paper, so it was difficult to even recognize that the protest happened in front of the embassy. But even for activists in exile, protesting in front of the UAE embassy can present a real risk. They have a noted history of transnational repression, and their reach and their arm is very long. And even activists who are safely in places like London and elsewhere in Europe may be subject to transnational repression from Emirati authorities, including the use of spyware and other forms of repression.
Why do you think the UAE is so sensitive to protests or anything that tarnishes their public image?
The UAE does not receive the criticism of its human rights record that its rights record deserves. Other countries from throughout the region, Saudi Arabia, regularly receive criticism of their rights record, but the UAE has become so effective at deflecting criticism through their large-scale investments in sporting and other entertainment events, people going to Dubai to work and to live. And so their human rights record does not really receive the attention that it deserves, despite being one of the worst in the Gulf and the Middle East more broadly. So they're incredibly sensitive to criticism, and so demonstrations like the one that happened a few weeks ago are very important to make sure that these cases are not forgotten, and to in fact make sure that Abdul Rahman Yusuf al-Qaradawi's life is protected, because right now he's forcibly disappeared. We have no information about him, so it's important for this attention to be sustained on his case so that he isn't subject to abuses such as torture and other forms of ill treatment.
There seems to be been an uptick in the number of politically motivated extraditions happening in the last few months, not just to the UAE, but various other countries. Almost all of them were on warrants circulated by the Arab Interior Ministers' Council. Have you noted this trend, and why do you think it's happening now?
Yeah, so over the past few years, in fact, we have documented a few cases involving the Council of Arab Interior Ministers, or Arab Interior Ministers Council. I cover both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and so these cases have come up quite organically in my work over the past few years. So we believe that Abdul Rahman's extradition request came through the Arab Interior Ministers Council. I covered a case a few years ago, a man's name, Khalaf al-Ramesi, an Emirati dissident who was living in exile in Turkey for many years, who traveled to Jordan and then was unlawfully deported from Jordan to the UAE on the basis of one of these Council of Arab Interior Ministers requests. This body has actually been around for many years. It's not a new body, but they have. It appears as though they are being sort of newly aggressive in their use of these extradition requests on the part of Gulf states to return human rights defenders and political dissidents to the country where they will face charges based off of their freedom of expression, assembly, and association.
Why do you think that's happening now?
It's a good question. This body is incredibly difficult to get any information on, and so we've been investigating, and yeah, we're sort of looking into this right now. I think it's these states may have sort of realized that it's in their interest to work together to repress dissidents that are living within their borders. But it's sort of anyone's guess at this point as to why we've seen an uptick in these cases and why this body has become more active in the last few years.
I was actually just about to ask you about al-Ramathi.
Yeah.
Has there been any news of him since he disappeared from a prison in Jordan? Is that correct? And we haven't heard from him since.
And so disappeared. So he was deported from Jordan back to the UAE.
Right. Yeah.
So we didn't have any news of him for a very long time. And then in December 2023, during COP28, the global climate change conference that was hosted by the UAE government, the Emirati government announced a host of new charges against at least 84 human rights defenders and political dissidents. This is sort of colloquially known as the UAE 84 mass trial. And Khalaf al-Ramathi, we believe, was part of this trial. Now, in July of 2024, so July last year, the State Security Court in Abu Dhabi handed down convictions and sentences for most of the defendants in this case, from between 15 years to life in prison. We actually don't have enough information about this case to know exactly what Khalaf received in this case, whether he was acquitted, what sentence he received if he was not acquitted. And this is, fundamentally the issue is this was the second largest mass trial case in the UAE's history, and we don't have a full list of the names of the defendants in this case, nor do we have a full list of the convictions, acquittals, and sentences. And that just sort of speaks to, how problematic and the violations that are embedded within the UAE's criminal justice system.
Do we have a sense of what has happened to the other defendants in this case? Are they being held in detention, presumably? What kind of conditions are they being held in?
Yeah, so we had some information while the trial was ongoing last year, because sadly some of the defendants had some communication with their family members, although it was extremely limited. We did find that many of the defendants were being held in prolonged solitary confinement, which under international law amounts to torture. We found that some of the defendants were being subjected to physical assaults and loud music being played at night to prevent them from sleeping. We unfortunately haven't had really any update from these defendants since this verdict was handed down in July of last year. We have fears that they are continuing to be held by Emirati authorities in prolonged solitary confinement. But again, very little information has been sort of released about their conditions and their situation at this point.
In January, the UAE added several UK companies to its terrorist list.
Yeah.
What do you think their strategy is on that?
Yeah, so the UAE regularly uses the allegation of terrorism and the use of terrorist lists to persecute human rights defenders and political dissidents. A few years ago, it added a number of well-known Emirati exiled activists, political dissidents to its terrorist lists. And again, this is just another form of its transnational repression. So we're looking into these companies. Some of these companies are related and are owned by dissidents abroad, and so this may be yet another form of the UAE's transnational repression, is going beyond its borders to try to prevent political dissidents from speaking out and using all of the sort of tools in their toolbox to repress that.
You said that the UAE's rights record doesn't get the attention it deserves. Why do you think that is, and what has been the response of countries like the UK, for example? Yeah,
so I think, when we talk about whitewashing, we talk about sports washing, we often think about Saudi Arabia these days, and of course, Saudi it's investing millions, billions into whitewashing, sports washing its rights record. But I really think that Saudi is sort of following the playbook of the UAE, that the UAE, started this game nearly 10 years ago. Nearly 10 years ago, investing in celebrities to come to Dubai to play concerts that folks want to go to, that when they think of the UAE, they don't think of someone like Ahmed Mansour, who has been languishing in an isolation cell for so many years. They think of, ex-celebrity instead. And I think that the UAE very effectively leverages its economic and security relationships with partners like the UK, like the US, to deflect criticism from its rights record. So, for example, right now, the UK is engaging in free trade negotiations with the GCC. Of course, this is not just the UAE, but includes Saudi, Bahrain, the rest of the GCC as well. But I think that this speaks to the sort of importance of economic relations that the UAE, is able to leverage to deflect criticism from its rights record.
Great, thank you. Those are all my questions.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.